It was a time when the halls of power in Europe were nothing short of treacherous. Amid the gilded walls of palaces and grand ballrooms, whispered rumors swirled like unseen shadows, touching the highest echelons of society. Beneath the veil of wealth and regal grandeur, there existed secrets that, if ever revealed, would rock the very foundations of monarchy. But this story, one hidden in the folds of royal history, remains largely forgotten. A scandal so profound that the very name of the Queen at the heart of it is scarcely spoken in the court's whispered gossip. Yet, her silence, her calculated, deliberate silence, has left a trail of mysteries that still haunt the pages of history. Welcome to the story of the Queen's silent scandal. Before we dive into the depths of this extraordinary tale, I must ask, how many of you have ever wondered what lies beneath the polished exterior of royalty? What secret truths are buried beneath the layers of elegance and grandeur, protected by the very forces that seem untouchable? The ones who appear flawless in the public eye but harbor a world of complexities, scandals, and dark whispers in private. I invite you to follow this journey with me. To uncover what has long been hidden, to experience the rise and fall of a queen who, in her silence, may have safeguarded more than a crown. Stay tuned, for this is just the beginning. Be sure to subscribe to the History One channel so you can hear the next part of this captivating story. Now, let us begin. The royal court of England in the 17th century was a place of beauty and intrigue. Castles lined the English countryside like monuments to power, and the ruling monarchy stood at the top of a world brimming with wealth, influence, and beauty. It was a time of grandeur, but also one of great peril. And it was here, in the heart of this glittering empire, that Queen Anne, wife of King George II, lived out her royal duties. The air in the palace was always heavy with expectation, with the promise of grandeur and rule. However, behind the sparkling facade of the Queen's court, something else was taking place, a secret, one so devastating that its very revelation could shatter the monarchy itself. Queen Anne was revered for her elegance, her calm demeanor, and her political acumen. She had been carefully groomed to fit the role of a perfect queen, the dutiful wife, the ever-smiling face of royal diplomacy. Yet, the truth, buried deep beneath her composed exterior, was far darker. Anne's marriage to King George II had been one forged in political necessity rather than love. From the moment they wed, she was keenly aware that her role was to be more than just a consort. She was expected to bear heirs, maintain the royal lineage, and present herself as the epitome of grace and virtue. But behind closed doors, Anne struggled with something that would not only tear at her sense of self, but would also place her in direct opposition to the very institution that had elevated her. For all her poise, Queen Anne was, in truth, a woman deeply lonely and conflicted. As her marriage remained cold and distant, she sought solace elsewhere. It was in the secret chambers of the palace, hidden away from prying eyes, that she met the one person who would change the course of her life. He was a man of extraordinary charm and ambition. His name was Lord Richard Arlington, a figure often seen in the shadows of the royal court, a man who knew the true power of influence. A nobleman, yes, but also one with his own ambitions that extended far beyond the control of the monarchy. Their first meeting was by happenstance, an accidental brush at one of the many lavish balls held at the palace. Anne, tired of her cold, formal life, found herself drawn to his presence. It wasn't long before their exchanges became more than mere pleasantries. In Lord Arlington, she found someone who understood her loneliness, someone who spoke to her, not as a queen, but as a woman. As their bond grew, so did their illicit love. It began in secrecy, whispers of stolen moments behind closed doors, and the quiet passage of notes that passed between them, like messages from a forbidden world. Anne, desperate for affection and feeling utterly trapped by her royal duties, sought solace in the arms of Lord Arlington. But this affair, while passionate and deeply personal, carried with it a price that neither of them could foresee. For Anne, it was a weight upon her heart, knowing that such a relationship, if ever uncovered, would bring ruin not only to her but to the monarchy as a whole. For Arlington, it was the potential to gain untold power, should the Queen's affection be his to command. What they did not know was that their every move was being watched. In the dark corridors of the palace, there were spies, men and women who moved in the shadows, working for those who sought to control the fate of the kingdom. Whispers were heard, and rumours began to swirl about the Queen's closeness with Lord Arlington. The court, as ever, was a breeding ground for gossip and suspicion, and soon enough, those in power began to notice the Queen's unusual behaviour. But Queen Anne was clever. She had long been a student of diplomacy and manipulation, and she knew how to play the game. She maintained the illusion of a perfect royal life, carefully curating the image of a devoted queen, never allowing the cracks in her personal life to show. She controlled her emotions in public, and walked the fine line between propriety and desire, with such skill that no one could truly understand what was happening behind the closed doors of her chambers. Yet, all it took was a single mistake, one moment of carelessness, to unravel the secret. The first whispers of scandal began to spread, slowly at first, then gathering speed like a storm approaching from the horizon. The people of the court began to gossip in hushed tones, their eyes constantly turning toward Anne with suspicion. And it was here, in this moment of rising tension, that the Queen's silence became her greatest weapon. She said nothing, not a word of confirmation, nor of denial. She allowed the rumours to fester, swirling around her like a thick fog. In her silence, Anne became an enigma, a woman of grace, power, and untold secrets. What was the truth? What was real? No one knew for sure. The Queen's silence, however, came at a great cost. As her reputation began to fray, Anne was forced to reckon with the political consequences of her affair. The king, oblivious to the details of her private life, began to suspect that something was amiss, and there were those within the court who were all too eager to see the Queen's downfall. But Anne's silence, her carefully measured restraint, kept her safe, at least for the time being. She controlled her own narrative, never allowing anyone to fully penetrate the truth of what was going on behind the palace walls. Yet, as history would later reveal, the Queen's scandal was not as silent as she had hoped. As the months passed, the whispers of the Queen's secret affair with Lord Arlington became impossible to ignore. It was no longer just idle gossip in the corners of the court. It was an open secret, one that had spread beyond the walls of the palace and into the streets of London. Rumours had taken on a life of their own, twisting and turning, growing darker with each retelling. But Queen Anne, ever composed, maintained her silence, refusing to address the matter directly. Her refusal to speak about the scandal created a vacuum, one filled by those eager to see her fall from grace. Court rivals, jealous courtiers, and even those within the royal family began to position themselves against her, waiting for her to slip. Her enemies, sensing an opportunity to strike, began to gather their forces, eager to exploit any weakness they could find. The Queen's silence, which had once been a shield, was beginning to feel like a chain, holding her captive in a world that was slowly closing in around her. She found herself increasingly isolated, her only solace being the stolen moments with Lord Arlington. Yet, even in the privacy of his embrace, the weight of her secret hung heavy between them. Both knew that their affair could never be fully realized. It was doomed to remain in the shadows, hidden from the world. Their love, so passionate and deep, was always at odds with the crown that loomed over Anne like an impenetrable wall. But the real storm had yet to come. In the midst of the growing scandal, an event occurred that would change everything. One evening, as the Queen and Lord Arlington met in the privacy of her chambers, a young servant girl, one who had been with the Queen for years, overheard a conversation that she was never meant to hear. The girl, innocent and naive, had no idea the gravity of what she had witnessed, but she understood enough to know that what she had just heard was something that could destroy a queen. She rushed to tell her parents, who were sympathetic to the Queen's position. They, in turn, told a trusted confidant within the palace, and within hours, the rumours began to spread once more, this time with an undeniable new edge. What had once been speculation was now backed by a direct witness, someone who could testify to the queen's actions. The shockwaves from this new revelation rippled through the court like a tidal wave. The whispers became louder, more insistent. The court could no longer ignore what was happening, but still, Anne remained silent, even as the walls of her world began to crumble. Her silence was no longer a shield, it had become a symbol of her defiance. She refused to give in to the pressure of her enemies. She would not admit to what they accused her of, nor would she confirm or deny the rumors. She let them speak, let them twist the truth, and allowed them to create their own narrative. In this way, Anne hoped that the storm would eventually pass, that time would dull the edges of the scandal, and that the monarchy would remain intact. However, time, it seemed, was not on her side. As the months wore on, King George began to grow suspicious. Though he had never been particularly involved in the affairs of the court, rumors had a way of reaching the ears of even the most detached monarchs. The Queen's silence, her distance, her increasing isolation, all of these things had not gone unnoticed. His unease grew, but he too said nothing, wary of making a public accusation without definitive proof. He was caught in a delicate balance, unsure whether to confront his wife or allow the matter to fade into the shadows, as Anne seemed to hope. But Anne's silence was not as foolproof as she believed. In the halls of the court, some began to conspire, plotting to use the Queen's silence as a tool to bring about her fall. The power struggle within the royal family reached a fever pitch. Certain factions began to whisper to the king, suggesting that his queen was unfit to rule, that her loyalty to the throne was compromised. These whispers, as venomous as they were, found fertile ground in the growing doubts of King George. Anne, though ever composed, began to feel the pressure of the storm closing in. In the privacy of her chambers, she wept quietly, knowing that her silence was no longer a choice, but a prison. Every day, the walls of her world grew smaller, as if the very palace around her were collapsing under the weight of her own secrets. Her relationship with Lord Arlington, once a source of solace, had become a constant reminder of the price she was paying for her silence. Yet, even as the storm raged around her, Anne held her ground. She would not be swayed, she would not bend. The Queen's silent scandal had become her own personal war, a battle fought not in the public eye but in the quiet of her own heart. But the revelation that would bring her downfall was yet to come. It came on a crisp autumn evening, when a letter was found, a letter that had been carefully hidden in one of Anne's private chambers. It was a letter from Lord Arlington, written in a language so intimate that even the mere act of reading it felt like an invasion. The letter was discovered by none other than Lady Evelyn, the Queen's closest confidant, who had been one of the few people left in her circle. But Lady Evelyn, once loyal, had her own ambitions. The letter was the final piece of the puzzle, and it sent shockwaves through the court when it was brought to the king's attention. The contents were not just scandalous, they were damning. In it, Lord Arlington spoke not only of his love for the Queen, but of their plans to escape together, to abandon the monarchy, and live a life free of the constraints of royal duty. It was a betrayal not only of Anne's marriage, but of everything the monarchy stood for. King George, now faced with undeniable evidence, could no longer remain silent. The storm had broken, and there was no turning back. As the letter from Lord Arlington found its way into the hands of King George, the entire kingdom trembled on the edge of ruin. The once immaculate image of Queen Anne, held together by the thin threads of political necessity and royal grace, had been ripped apart by the damning words of a letter. The king's face, a mask of fury and disbelief, darkened as he read the words that no queen, no wife should ever have to hear. In the royal chambers, Anne's world shattered. She had spent so many months playing the game, maintaining the facade of royal decorum while secretly bearing the weight of her love for Arlington. But now, the game was over. The truth, cruel and unrelenting, had come to light in the most devastating way possible. Anne's silence, which had been her armor, now seemed like her greatest mistake. It was no longer the shield that protected her, but the very thing that had allowed her enemies to fester and grow in strength. The whispers that had once been hushed now echoed throughout the palace, reverberating through every stone and wood beam as if the entire court was conspiring against her. But it wasn't just the court that knew. The common folk, too, had heard rumors. The scandal had made its way to the streets of London, where gossip, fueled by those who had no allegiance to the crown, spread like wildfire. Every tavern, every marketplace was alive with speculation about the Queen's affair, her betrayal, and the damning letter that now served as proof. The monarchy, fragile as it was, stood on the brink. The king, faced with the undeniable evidence of his wife's infidelity and her plans to leave him for another man, found himself with few options. Anne's disgrace threatened not only her personal reputation but the very stability of the royal family. A summons was issued. The Queen was called to stand before her husband, her king, and explain herself. Her once unbreakable composure was now gone, replaced by an uneasy fear. She knew that nothing she said could undo the damage that had already been done. The letter had sealed her fate, and no amount of royal dignity could cover the truth it exposed. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Queen Anne, dressed in the royal garb she had once worn with such pride, walked toward the throne room with a heavy heart. The halls seemed darker, the air colder than she remembered. It felt as if the very palace itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment of reckoning. Inside the throne room, King George sat upon his throne, his face a mask of royal authority, though the fury in his eyes betrayed the deep betrayal he felt. Around him, the royal court had gathered noblemen and women who had once looked upon Anne with admiration, now casting sidelong glances, whispers of doubt clouding their judgment. Even Lady Evelyn stood in the back, her face unreadable, though her eyes flickered with a sense of satisfaction that she had played a role in the Queen's downfall. Anne stood before her husband, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between them was suffocating, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the first words to break the tense stillness. "Anne," King George began, his voice cold, every word a dagger. "You have betrayed me, you have betrayed the crown, and most of all, you have betrayed the people who placed their trust in you." Anne swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, to explain, to justify her actions, but what could she say? The truth was out, and there was no escaping the weight of it. She had sought comfort in Lord Arlington's arms because she had felt abandoned by her husband, neglected by the very system that had bound her to this throne. She had been lonely, desperate for affection, and Arlington had given her everything she had craved. But that wasn't something a queen could say. The monarchy demanded loyalty, and she had failed. Anne began, her voice trembling, but she was cut off. "Do you deny it?" George's voice was sharp, unforgiving. "Do you deny that you planned to abandon your duties, to leave the crown, and to run away with that man?" "No," Anne whispered, her head hanging in shame. "I do not deny it." A murmur spread through the court. The Queen had admitted to everything. The scandal, once a mere rumor, had now been confirmed by the Queen herself. "Do you understand what this means?" the king demanded, his voice rising. "You have tainted the very bloodline that has ruled this kingdom for generations. You have put everything at risk." Anne's knees trembled as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I never wanted to hurt you, George. I never wanted to destroy everything we built." But the king's face remained unmoved. "You have, nonetheless. The scandal is too great. The people will no longer look upon you with respect. You are a stain upon this monarchy, Anne." Anne's heart sank as the weight of his words settled in. She had always known the consequences of her actions, but to hear them so starkly laid out by her own husband was a blow she couldn't recover from. The monarchy she had served so dutifully, the crown she had once worn with pride, was now slipping through her fingers like sand. But the final blow came when King George turned to his council, his gaze sweeping over the assembled courtiers. "I will no longer tolerate such betrayal. The Queen is no longer fit to hold her title. From this day forward, she shall be stripped of her royal privileges. She will be exiled from the court." The words were like daggers, and Anne felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her once proud position as queen was gone, erased by her own actions, her own choices. But there was one final twist to the tale. As Anne was escorted from the throne room, the whispers began once more, louder this time, echoing through the halls. "It's not over," they said. "The Queen will not be forgotten." Anne, stripped of her title and her dignity, was exiled to a remote estate far from the palace, a prisoner of her own making. Lord Arlington, too, vanished from the court, his name erased from the royal annals as if he had never existed. Though Anne's scandal had rocked the monarchy, it was not the end. Over time, the whispers faded, but the memory of the Queen's silent scandal would remain a dark chapter in the history of the British monarchy, a tale of love, betrayal, and the cost of silence. Years passed, and the scandal that had once shaken the royal family began to fade from public memory, at least in the circles of power. But for Queen Anne, now living in exile far from the glittering halls of her once glorious court, the weight of her actions lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Her days were spent in quiet reflection, and although she no longer wore the crown, she still carried its burden in her heart. Anne's exile was not the life of a prisoner, at least not in the traditional sense. She was granted a small estate on the outskirts of the kingdom, away from the palace and the public eye. The estate, though beautiful in its own way, was isolated. The servants who attended to her were few, and the only visitors were those who brought news of the world she had once ruled, though none dared speak of the scandal that had led to her downfall. It was as if everyone, including Anne, had agreed to let time do what it always does: erase the pain, dull the sharp edges of memory, and fade the vivid details of a life once lived in the limelight. But Anne was not a woman to be easily forgotten. The whispers still reached her, carried on the winds of gossip. It was not the grand stories that reached her, but the small, subtle ones, the rumors about her life in exile. Her isolation seemed to have sparked a sense of mystery among those who had once followed her, a fascination with the woman who had been queen but had fallen so far. In the years following her removal from court, Anne began to hear of strange things, odd rumors that stirred something deep within her. It seemed there were those who had not forgotten her, and though the court had officially distanced itself from her, some still spoke of her with reverence. Among the whispers that drifted through the kingdom, one name kept appearing: Lord Arlington. His disappearance from the court had been just as sudden and complete as Anne's fall from grace, but unlike Anne, his shadow had not faded into the ether. Rumors began to swirl about his whereabouts, about his influence behind the scenes, and even about his covert role in the court after Anne's exile. Some suggested he had been exiled alongside her, others said he had returned to the court under a different identity. But the most intriguing rumor was that Lord Arlington had, in some way, been involved in orchestrating the events that led to Anne's scandal, and that he had never truly left the palace. In fact, some believed he still had powerful allies within the court, allies who had helped him escape scrutiny. It was this new rumor that intrigued Anne the most. If Lord Arlington had managed to slip away unnoticed, then perhaps her scandal had not been as isolated as she had once thought. Perhaps the conspiracy against her had been even greater than she had known. In the solitude of her exile, Anne began to piece together the threads of her story. She had never been a woman prone to recklessness, and she realized now that her affair with Lord Arlington had not been a simple act of love or longing, but part of something larger. She could feel it, deep in her bones. She had been used. Arlington had played his part in her downfall, and now, even in exile, Anne knew she could not rest until she discovered the full truth of what had happened. It was in this moment of self-reflection that Anne made a decision that would set the course for the rest of her life. She would leave her exile. She would return to the court, not as a queen, but as a woman determined to reclaim her dignity and uncover the truth of the conspiracy that had stolen everything from her. And so, in the dead of night, Anne set out. Disguised in plain clothing, she ventured far from the isolated estate and made her way to the heart of London. Her journey was dangerous, and there were those who would recognize her, but she was determined. The path that had once led her to power was now leading her to the answers she had long sought, and if the road was perilous, she would face it with the resolve of a woman who had already lost everything. Anne's return to London was fraught with tension. She stayed in the shadows, moving quietly through the city, careful to avoid detection. She knew that, even now, she would be hunted if the wrong people discovered who she was, but she could not be dissuaded. Her first priority was to find Lord Arlington, to confront him and learn the truth of what had transpired all those years ago. It was not long before she found a lead, an old contact from the palace, who had once served as one of the courtiers in her court. The man, a former chamberlain named Henry, had left the palace after her fall from grace and disappeared into the streets of London. He had always been a quiet, observant man, and Anne knew that if anyone knew the truth about the court's inner workings, it would be him. After several days of searching, Anne finally found Henry, sitting in a tavern at the edge of the city. The dimly lit room was filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, but in the corner, Henry sat alone, nursing a drink. He looked older now, his face worn with time, but his sharp eyes remained as keen as ever. Anne approached him cautiously, unsure of what his reaction would be. She had once been a queen, but now she was nothing more than a shadow of that life. "Henry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked up, startled, his eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation, but then he smiled. "Your Majesty?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise and a touch of sorrow. "I never thought I'd see you again." Anne nodded. "I need to know what happened all those years ago. I need to know what Arlington was really involved in." Henry's face hardened as he set down his glass. He looked around cautiously, ensuring no one was eavesdropping. "Come with me," he said, rising from his seat. "There's much you don't know, and it's time you heard the truth." Anne followed Henry through the winding, dimly lit streets of London. The cold night air cut through her thin cloak, but it was the urgency of the moment that kept her warm. Henry led her to a secluded part of the city, an area where the wealthy and powerful once lived, but now only the poor and desperate called home. The buildings were old and decaying, but there was a certain secrecy to this area, a place where dealings of all kinds were kept hidden from the prying eyes of the court. They arrived at a narrow alley, where Henry knocked 3 times on a weathered door. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Without a word, Henry motioned for Anne to enter, and she stepped inside cautiously. The room was small and sparse, with only a single table and a few chairs. It smelled of stale tobacco and old parchment. A fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. At the table sat an older man, his back to them, writing something in a ledger. He did not look up when they entered, but Henry immediately went to him, whispering something Anne could not quite catch. The man looked over his shoulder and, upon seeing Anne, froze for a moment. His face tightened, his eyes flicking to Henry with an unspoken question. But then, with a resigned sigh, he put down his quill and motioned for them to sit. "Anne," the man said quietly, "it's been many years, but you've come for answers, haven't you?" Anne's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Edmund, the palace scribe. Edmund had been one of the few people she trusted at court. His position had allowed him to overhear things, to witness things that no one else could. He had known everything about the palace's secrets, everything about what had transpired in those dark, shadowy corners of power, and if anyone could give her the answers she sought, it was Edmund. "Yes, I need to know everything," Anne replied, her voice tight. "I need to understand why they did this, why I was betrayed." Edmund met her gaze and then nodded, his face grave. He gestured to the chair, across from him. "Sit. This will take time." Anne sat down, and Henry took a seat beside her. Edmund leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him, as if he were preparing to deliver a confession of his own. "You must understand," he began, his voice low. "There were forces at work in the court that even the king did not fully comprehend. The scandal, the affair, was never just about you and Lord Arlington. No, it was much bigger than that. Anne's mind raced as she listened intently, her pulse quickening. She had known, deep down, that the story was more complicated than it appeared. But to hear that confirmation, to know that something far darker had been at play, was a shock to her system. "Explain," Anne urged. Edmund's eyes darkened. "Arlington was never just your lover, Anne. He was a tool, a pawn in a much larger game. The affair was orchestrated, not by him, but by others. There were members of the court, powerful men, who were trying to manipulate you, to discredit you, and to weaken the monarchy. Arlington's role was simply to be the one to drive the wedge between you and the king." Anne felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She had believed that her love for Arlington had been her own desperate attempt to find affection in a cold and loveless marriage. But to hear that it had all been part of a larger scheme, a scheme meant to bring her down, it was almost too much to bear. "But why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would they do that to me? To the throne?" "Power, Anne," Edmund said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "In the court, power is everything. Some men wanted to control the kingdom, to place their own people in positions of authority. They knew that if the monarchy were to remain strong, you, as queen, would be a symbol of stability. But if they could weaken you, discredit you, they could manipulate your husband and eventually the entire kingdom." Henry leaned forward, his eyes flashing with intensity. "They knew Arlington had influence over you, that you trusted him, so they used that. They planted rumors, staged events, manipulated the narrative. All they needed was to create doubt in the king's mind, doubt about you, doubt about your loyalty. And once that was done, they would have the power to control everything." Anne's heart pounded in her chest. It was all falling into place now. The whispers, the eyes that followed her every move, the subtle pressure she had felt, even when things had seemed calm. It hadn't been just the affair, it had been the timing, the deliberate way in which everything had unraveled. "Who were these men?" Anne demanded, her voice rising with anger. "Who are they?" Edmund glanced at Henry, as if silently asking for permission. Henry nodded solemnly. "They were members of the Privy Council," Edmund said, his eyes narrowing. "Men who had been working in the shadows for years, manipulating the court for their own gain. Some of them were close to the king. Others were ambitious lords, seeking to increase their wealth and power. But the most dangerous of them all was Lord Hargrave." Anne's breath caught in her throat. Lord Hargrave had been a constant presence in her court, always with a smile, always with flattering words. He had been a trusted advisor to the king, and Anne had always believed him to be a loyal servant of the crown. "He was the mastermind," Edmund continued. "Hargrave saw you as a threat, Anne, not because you were a bad queen, but because you were a strong one. And strong queens don't bend to the will of men like him. He used Arlington to get to you, to drive a wedge between you and George." The realization hit Anne like a physical blow. Lord Hargrave, the very man she had once trusted, had orchestrated her downfall. He had used her own emotions against her, manipulating her love for Arlington to tear apart her marriage and, by extension, her place in the royal family. The truth was more bitter than Anne had ever imagined. Her love for Arlington had been twisted into a weapon against her. The pain, the isolation, the betrayal, it had all been carefully crafted by those who wanted to bring her down. "And Arlington?" Anne asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and anger. "What of him? Was he in on it?" Edmund hesitated. "I don't think he knew the full extent of it, Anne. He was as much a pawn as you were. Hargrave used his charm to manipulate him, to make him believe he was acting on his own desires. But he was controlled, just like you were." Anne's mind raced, but the feeling of betrayal was too overwhelming. "And what do I do now? How can I take back what was stolen from me?" Edmund leaned forward, his voice soft but resolute. "The first step is to make them understand that you know the truth. You must go to the king, confront Hargrave, and expose everything. The court will listen to you, Anne. It's not too late to reclaim your power." Anne's eyes burned with the fire of determination. She had been a pawn once, but no more. She would not let Lord Hargrave and the other conspirators get away with this. She had been silent for too long, but now it was time to speak and to fight for what was rightfully hers. Anne's resolve hardened as she sat across from Henry and Edmund. The knowledge of the conspiracy, of the men who had used her and manipulated her love, burned in her chest. She had been a queen, once the heart of the monarchy, a symbol of strength and virtue. Yet, they had torn her down, turned her love into a weapon against her, and stripped her of everything she had worked so hard to build. But no longer. She would not be a victim. The time for silence had passed, and she knew now that she had to reclaim her dignity for herself, for her legacy, and for the throne that had been her birthright. "I will confront him," Anne declared, her voice strong, cutting through the room, like a sharp blade. "I will go to George, and I will make him see the truth." Henry's eyes widened with concern. "Anne, you must be careful. Lord Hargrave's power is still strong. He controls the Privy Council, and many in the court are loyal to him. You could be walking into a trap." Anne stood up, her posture regal, despite the years of exile and loss. "I have nothing left to lose, Henry. They have already taken everything, but I will not let them take my voice, my power, my right to stand as the queen I was meant to be. If I fall on my own terms." Edmund nodded gravely. "Then you must be prepared. The king, he has his own fears and doubts, and Hargrave has poisoned his mind. It won't be easy to change his opinion of you, even now." Anne clenched her fists, the cold night air biting at her skin as the weight of what she was about to do settled in. She would have to confront the very man who had once been her husband, the king who had turned away from her in her darkest hour. But it was not just the king she feared. It was the powerful men in the court who controlled him, the ones who had used Lord Arlington as a pawn to manipulate her life. Her plan was simple, yet dangerous. She would go to the king, confront Hargrave, and expose everything. She would not hide in the shadows anymore. She would stand tall and force the truth to be heard. The next day, Anne made her way back to the royal palace, her heart heavy with the enormity of the task before her. As she approached the towering gates, the familiar sight of the palace struck her in a way she had not anticipated. It was both comforting and painful, a reminder of everything she had lost. Yet there was no turning back. She had come this far, and she would finish what she had started. The palace was as magnificent as ever, its grand halls filled with the hustle and bustle of court life. But today, everything felt different. Anne felt the eyes of the courtiers upon her as she passed, the whispers that had once been hidden now out in the open. She had been the queen, the heart of this court, but now she was an outsider, a woman fighting for her very name. Anne made her way to the throne room, her steps echoing in the grand corridor. As she entered, she was met with the sight of King George, seated on his throne, his regal demeanor still intact despite the passing years. His eyes, once filled with love for her, now seemed cold, distant. The man she had once known seemed a stranger to her now. Anne took a deep breath and stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. The courtiers, who had been murmuring among themselves, fell silent. All eyes were on her as she approached the throne. "George," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest, "we need to talk." The king looked up at her, his expression unreadable. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Anne," he said, his voice distant, "you have come back to this court after all these years. What is it you seek?" "I have already made my decision." Anne's heart sank at the coldness in his tone. He had already made his decision about her, about everything. She could see it in his eyes. He had believed the lies, the rumors. He had turned away from her once before, but now it seemed that the final wedge had been driven between them. But Anne would not let him dismiss her. She could not. "George," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "What you have been told is a lie. Everything you believe about me, about my betrayal, it was all a trap. I was manipulated by Lord Hargrave and his men. They used me, just as they used Arlington. The affair, the scandal, it was all part of a larger plan, a plan to weaken the monarchy and gain control over you. The room was silent, as Anne's words hung in the air. The king's eyes narrowed, as though he were processing what she had just said. "Lord Hargrave," the king asked, his voice laced with suspicion, "you expect me to believe this?" Anne stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. "I expect you to listen, George. Lord Hargrave and his allies in the court orchestrated everything. They wanted to discredit me, to turn you against me, and to take control of the kingdom. The affair with Arlington was a part of their plan. They knew you would believe it, and they used it against us both." There was a long silence before the king spoke again, his voice softer this time. "And what of Arlington? Was he part of this plot as well?" Anne's eyes flickered with pain, but she nodded. "Yes. Arlington was manipulated just as I was. He was made to believe that he was acting on his own desires, but he was being controlled. He never intended to harm me, George. He loved me, but he was a pawn, just like me." The king was silent, his brow furrowed as he processed her words. Anne could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between what he had believed and what she was now telling him. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. "I want to believe you, Anne," the king said quietly. "But how do I know this is true? How do I know you are not lying to me now, as you lied to me before?" Anne stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "I understand your doubts, George, but I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for your trust. The truth is not always what it seems, but I swear to you, I have never betrayed you. I have only ever tried to protect this kingdom and protect you." The king looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood, slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Very well, Anne," he said, "I will listen, but you must understand, this will not be easy. You have damaged my trust, and I cannot simply forget that." Anne nodded. "I do not expect you to. But I will not stand by and allow those who would tear us apart to win. I will fight for the truth, for our kingdom." And so, with those words, Anne began the final battle of her life. She would expose the full extent of the conspiracy, not only to save herself but to reclaim her place in history, to restore the monarchy to what it had been meant to be, a symbol of strength, not division. The storm had come, but Anne was ready to face it head-on, no longer silent, no longer afraid. The days that followed Anne's confrontation with King George were a blur of action, tension, and secrecy. Anne had made her stand, she had spoken the truth, and now it was time to expose the full extent of the conspiracy that had torn apart her life and threatened the very stability of the monarchy. But the path forward was fraught with peril. The forces she was up against were powerful, and their influence reached deep into the heart of the court. In the weeks that followed, Anne worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, rallying those loyal to her, and carefully planning her next moves. She knew she could not confront Lord Hargrave and the other conspirators directly. They were far too dangerous for that. But she had a different strategy in mind: to turn the tide of public opinion and use the very court that had once condemned her to her advantage. Her first ally in this battle came in the form of Edmund, the former palace scribe. Once loyal to her, he had watched from the shadows as the court had turned against her, but now he was determined to help her bring the truth to light. Edmund had spent years observing the inner workings of the palace, and his knowledge of the court's secrets was invaluable. With his help, Anne began to piece together the pieces of the puzzle, tracking the movements of Lord Hargrave and his co-conspirators. But even as Anne worked behind the scenes, the tension in the palace continued to rise. King George, though still skeptical, had agreed to listen. He had not yet fully embraced Anne's version of events, but he had allowed her to present her case. The court was divided. Some courtiers were sympathetic to Anne, believing her to be the victim of a larger plot, while others remained loyal to Lord Hargrave, refusing to believe that the conspiracy had ever existed. One night, as Anne sat in her small quarters, reviewing the documents and letters she had gathered, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Henry standing in the doorway, a grave expression on his face. "Anne," he said quietly, "I have news." Anne motioned for him to come inside. "What is it?" Henry stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "It's Hargrave. He's been meeting with several of the king's advisors in secret. There's talk of an alliance, a plan to neutralize you once and for all." Anne felt her pulse quicken. "What do they plan to do?" "They want to frame you, Anne," Henry replied, his voice low. "They want to make it look as though you've been plotting against the crown all along. They'll use everything, your affair with Arlington, the rumors of your betrayal, even your return to court, as proof of your disloyalty." Anne's stomach dropped. "They'll ruin me then," Henry nodded. "If they succeed, they'll destroy you, and they'll have full control of the throne. But there's still time to stop them. You have to act quickly, Anne. You need to expose them before they can expose you." Anne stood up, her mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. Lord Hargrave and his allies were moving swiftly, and if she didn't act fast, she would lose everything. She had no choice but to go on the offensive. "Gather the evidence," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll confront them directly. I'll go to the king and show him everything." Henry hesitated. "Are you sure, Anne? You know what you're up against. Hargrave has too much power. He's already turned many against you. If you fail—" "I won't fail," Anne interrupted, her eyes blazing with determination. "I've lost too much already. I won't let them destroy everything I've worked for. If I have to fight, I will, and I will make them see the truth." The next day, Anne prepared for the most dangerous confrontation of her life. She knew that this would be her last chance to expose the full scope of the conspiracy and save her name. If she failed now, there would be no turning back. The palace was abuzz with rumors of her upcoming appearance before the king. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what Anne would say and whether she would be able to prove her accusations. Anne could feel the eyes upon her as she walked through the corridors, the whispers growing louder with every step. It was as though the entire court was holding its breath, waiting to see whether she would triumph or be crushed by the weight of her own scandal. When Anne arrived in the throne room, the king was already seated on his throne, his eyes trained on her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. His advisors were present as well, their faces unreadable. Lord Hargrave was among them, standing tall and confident, as though he had already won the battle. But Anne could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew that this confrontation was different from all the others. This time, he was not the one in control. Anne stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared herself for this moment for weeks, and now there was no turning back. She had the truth on her side, and she would not be silenced again. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I come before you today, not as a queen, but as a woman who has been wronged, a woman who has been manipulated and betrayed." The courtiers leaned in, their attention rapt. Anne could feel the weight of their eyes upon her, but she did not falter. "For years, I have been the subject of rumors and lies. I have been accused of betraying you, of betraying the crown. But the truth, Your Majesty, is that I have never been disloyal. The conspiracy against me was not of my making. I was used, manipulated, and controlled by men who sought to weaken the monarchy and take power for themselves." A murmur swept through the court, but Anne continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Lord Hargrave, along with his allies in the Privy Council, orchestrated my downfall. They planted rumors, fueled the affair with Lord Arlington, and turned you against me. Their goal was not only to ruin me, but to take control of the throne and bend you to their will. They thought they could use my love, my pain, as a weapon, but they underestimated me." Lord Hargrave's face reddened, and his eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape, but there was nowhere for him to hide. Anne had laid bare the truth, and now the court could see it for themselves. "I have proof," Anne said, reaching into her satchel and pulling out the letters and documents that Edmund had gathered. "These documents show the secret meetings between Hargrave and his allies. They reveal the full extent of their plot to destroy me and take control of the throne." Anne placed the papers before the king, her gaze unwavering as she waited for him to read them. The room was deathly silent as King George carefully examined the documents, his face shifting from disbelief to shock. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and regret. "How could I have been so blind?" he murmured. "Your Majesty," Anne said softly, "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you or this kingdom. But I will not stand idly by while others manipulate us for their own gain." The king stood, his face a mixture of regret and determination. "I will deal with this," he said, his voice steady now. "Lord Hargrave, you are hereby dismissed from the Privy Council. You will be investigated for your role in this conspiracy, and if found guilty, you will face the consequences of your actions." Anne's heart soared with a sense of triumph. For the first time in years, she felt as though she had regained control. But even as the king turned his gaze toward Hargrave, Anne knew that the battle was far from over. The court would be divided, and there would be many who would still seek to discredit her. But she was ready. She had fought for her truth, and she would continue to fight for the future of the monarchy. The truth had come to light, and with it, Anne had reclaimed her voice. The days following the confrontation in the throne room were filled with both triumph and tension. Lord Hargrave, though once the king's closest advisor, had been swiftly removed from the Privy Council, and the whispers about him spread like wildfire through the court. His influence had been significant, but his disgrace was now undeniable. It was clear that he had underestimated Anne. Underestimated the strength of a woman who had been silenced for so long, but had found her voice when it mattered most. Yet while the immediate danger had passed, Anne knew that the path ahead was far from certain. The court remained divided, with some courtiers rallying behind her, acknowledging the truth of her claims, while others clung to the old narratives. Unwilling to believe that one of their own had been so deeply compromised, Anne could feel the weight of their judgment, even if it was no longer openly expressed. The truth had been exposed, but the seeds of doubt still lingered. King George, despite his regret over being manipulated, was a man torn between his past love for Anne and the political realities of the monarchy. Though he had allowed her to present her case and had taken action against Hargrave, Anne knew that the king's trust in her had been shattered. It was impossible to erase the years of separation, the betrayal he had felt. And yet, there was a flicker of something more, a glimmer of the affection they had once shared, a distant echo of the bond that had united them. Anne spent her days in quiet reflection, away from the court's prying eyes. She knew that her return had been a victory, but it was a victory that came at a great cost. Her reputation had been irrevocably changed, and she could never go back to the woman she had once been. The love she had for George, for the monarchy, was now complicated, tainted by the betrayals that had nearly destroyed her. But she could not afford to dwell in the past. There was still much to be done. The court was in turmoil, with factions vying for power in the wake of Hargrave's fall. The Privy Council was now in a state of flux, and those who had once aligned themselves with Hargrave were scrambling to find new ways to secure their influence. It was in this vacuum of power that Anne saw an opportunity not just for herself, but for the monarchy. She began to quietly assemble a group of loyal courtiers, men and women who believed in her vision for a stronger, more united kingdom. They spoke in whispers, in secret meetings held behind closed doors, but their goal was clear: to restore the monarchy to its rightful place, to cleanse the court of those who would seek to use the crown for their own gain, and to build a future in which the monarchy could thrive. But even as Anne took these steps, she could not ignore the growing tension between herself and the king. George, though he had not publicly repudiated her, was distant. The royal marriage, once the symbol of strength and unity, had become a shadow of what it had been. Anne had known this would be the case, but it did not make it any easier. She had always believed in the power of the crown, in the duty that came with it, but now she realized that the crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of sacrifice. One evening, as Anne sat alone in her chambers, contemplating the future, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose to answer it, and to her surprise, it was King George standing in the doorway. His face was somber, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. Anne nodded, stepping aside to allow him entry. She had not expected to see him like this alone, without the formality and distance that usually separated them. The king closed the door behind him, and they stood in silence for a moment. Anne's heart raced, unsure of what to say, unsure of what this meeting would bring. "I've been thinking, Anne," George said finally, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion, "about everything that has happened, about what you've said and what I've done. I've failed you in many ways, and I can't pretend that things can just go back to the way they were." Anne's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this, had known that their relationship could never return to its former state, but to hear him speak the words aloud, to acknowledge the damage that had been done, was still a painful blow. "I never wanted this," she said softly. "I never wanted to hurt you, George. I was manipulated, just as you were. But I will not allow anyone to take this throne from us. I will fight for it, for our kingdom, for everything we once believed in." George's gaze softened, and for a brief moment Anne saw the man she had once loved. The king, the leader, the man who had been her partner. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold reality of their circumstances. "I know you will," he said quietly. "And I will stand by you, but I don't know what we can rebuild, the trust between us, Anne. It's not the same anymore." Anne nodded, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She had known this would be difficult, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. They were not the same people they had been, and the monarchy they had once shared was no longer the same. But Anne still believed in its potential. She still believed that, despite everything, they could build something stronger, something more enduring. "I don't know what the future holds, George," she said, her voice steady. "But I know that I will fight for this kingdom. I will fight for the crown. And I will fight for you, if you'll allow me." The king looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers as if trying to find some trace of the woman he had once known. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers. "Perhaps there is still hope," he said softly. "Perhaps there is still a way forward." And for the first time in many years, Anne allowed herself to believe that there might be. The road ahead would be long, and there would be many battles still to fight, but she had taken the first step, and she had made her stand. She had fought for the truth, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her power. Together, Anne and George would navigate the tumultuous waters of the royal court, struggling to rebuild what had been broken, to restore the monarchy to its rightful place. But for Anne, this battle was more than just about the crown. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her future. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for certain: she would not be silenced again.